Thank you for being here today, and thank you for your patience, and thank you most of all for filling out our survey. That's really helpful as we move forward with the library's strategic plan for the next 5 years per requirement of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I'm Alice Cooper, the director of the library and the elevator operator. I just wanted to thank the Sundays at 2 committee because this is the last program for 2022. So if everyone who is here from the committee could stand up, that would be awesome. Yay! And each committee member is in charge of a program. They make all of the arrangements with the speaker and do the press release and arrange lunch with the speaker. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce Pat Tracy, who will introduce our speaker today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you all for being here. It's my privilege today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Susan Schoelwer, whose position is, catch your breath here, Executive Director of Historic Preservation and Collections and the Robert H. Smith Senior Curator at George Washington's Mount Vernon. If you had not had the opportunity to visit the slavery exhibit at George Washington's Mount Vernon, unfortunately it has closed, but it was among the most impactful things I've ever witnessed. It was really wonderful. At lunch today, we asked Susan how she chose her career, and she tells us that she likes to do history with things, and this was a lot cleaner than archaeology. So, it's our privilege today to hear her talk about this exhibit, how it came to be, and some of the impacts and learnings from it. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Pat. It is good, as they say, to know your limitations. And dirt is one of mine. Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me today. It is always a treat to be down in your beautiful and, of course, very historic corner of the world. And thank you for turning out on such a beautiful afternoon. Now, all of you, I'm sure, know Mount Vernon as the home of America's preeminent founding father, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and first president of our fledgling republic, founded on the ringing pronouncement that, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." He was also a slave owner, inheriting 10 people when his father died when George was 11 years old. And he continued to own people throughout his life, and their labor made possible many of his accomplishments. Notably, at the end of his life, he included in his will a clause providing for the slaves he owned to be freed, intending to set an example for other slave owners to follow. But even so, his heirs brought new slaves to operate the plantation until it was purchased in 1860 by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, known as the MVLA, for the purpose of preserving it as a historic site. The stated mission of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association from then until today has been to restore and present Mount Vernon as it appeared in George Washington's time, when it was a working agricultural enterprise, a plantation fueled by enslaved labor. So incorporating the enslaved community into George Washington's story and the presentation of life at Mount Vernon is thus integral to full understanding of Washington and Mount Vernon, and necessary to the fulfillment of our core mission of preservation and education. Now, in October 2016, as Pat mentioned, Mount Vernon opened its first major exhibition devoted to exploring the lives of the enslaved people of Mount Vernon. Like our other special exhibitions, it was conceived of as a temporary installation, intended to present the results of decades of research and to spur further inquiry and greater public awareness of this important subject. Because of its significance and its timeliness, it ended up being extended from the original 1 year to nearly 5 years. had hoped, it proved to be a transformational initiative, and it remains a cornerstone of Mount Vernon's ongoing efforts to present a more inclusive and authentic view of life on George and Martha Washington's estate. As the exhibition title, Lives Bound Together, suggests, the lives of the Washingtons and the individuals they enslaved were so closely intertwined, it is really impossible to fully understand the former without considering the latter. So this afternoon, I want to offer you a recap of the exhibition, accompanied by a behind-the-scenes look at our motivation for the exhibition, some of the resources we drew on, some of the challenges we encountered, the solutions we devised, and some of the outcomes. Planning for this exhibition began in 2013, prompted by three main considerations. First, audience interest. People were coming to Mount Vernon. They knew George Washington owned slaves, and they were asking questions and wanting to know more. Secondly, we had a critical mass of evidence, extensive manuscripts. George Washington's papers are voluminous. They run to some 70 volumes. And he had this very nitty-gritty attention to the details of plantation management. So as a result, his papers provide rich information about the lives of enslaved individuals, sometimes down to the level of who was doing what job in which field for how many hours on a given day. For example, on this day, May 1st, in 1788, we know that on one of Washington's 5 farms, quote, the women, having made holes for corn, went to making pumpkin holes in the angles of the fences. At another of the farms, quote, the women were at work in the new ground. This example is a page from the Census of the Enslaved that Washington created in the summer of 1799. And it's really kind of the Rosetta Stone of our research, and I'll talk about it a bit more later. We also have 450 acres of George Washington's home farm with 15 original structures, not only the mansion, but also many of the work buildings that support it. We have the findings of 35 years of systematic archaeological excavations of sites associated with slavery on the estate. And so together, these primary sources put us in position to talk about slavery through the stories of individual lives rather than faceless statistics. So a humanizing perspective that is all too rarely possible for enslaved people in the 18th century America. Now, of course, George Washington is and remains at the center of Mount Vernon's reason for being. And for this exhibit, we wanted to very explicitly link his story to that of the hundreds of enslaved people who were also integral to the human community and economic operations at Mount Vernon. So the exhibition opened with the iconic Udon bust of Washington done in 1785, seen through a glass wall etched with the names of 317 enslaved individuals living at Mount Vernon in 1799. Knowing these names, just knowing the names, helps connect us to individuals and makes them real. Eliminates the dehumanized abstractions with which we often talk about slavery as an institution. Framing the bust were 4 introductory wall panels. Here, a quote from George Washington and one from Edmund Parker, who had been enslaved at Mount Vernon after George Washington's death and was later in the late 19th century a hired guard at Washington's tomb. This panel made 3 key points. First, it underlined our efforts to try and strike a balance between acknowledging the painful legacy of slavery, but also affirming the strength and humanity of those who were enslaved. Second, we deliberately called out the importance of vocabulary, making explicit our decision to avoid using the word slave when referring to individuals, replacing this term with enslaved as an adjective, emphasizing that this was not an inherent identity, but an imposed status. And third, it offered this vivid infographic that you see at the bottom. In 1799, there were 5 Washington family members that you see here at the bottom. Here we go. There were about 15 or 20 white hired workers, and as I mentioned, there were 317 enslaved people. So when you see this demographic, I think it really shifts your understanding of what that community was like. Turning into the next gallery, visitors encountered elegant drinking and dining wares, goods that made up Washington's world, both the imperial and commercial world of the British Atlantic and the intimate domestic world of the household. Many of these items were familiar favorites from Mount Vernon's previous decorative arts exhibition, and perhaps surprising to some to encounter in an exhibition on slavery. Our goal in beginning the exhibit this way was to prompt visitors to approach these familiar decorative arts objects and images with different questions. Not only who made or owned this object, like the silver coffee pot at the bottom left, but whose hands touched it, who cleaned and polished it, whose labor created the wealth that purchased it. Pursuing such questions, we came to see that stories of the enslaved are embedded in virtually every object in our collection. In a global context, silver and porcelain vessels for serving elite beverages like coffee, tea, chocolate, punch were juxtaposed against equally familiar graphics of the brutal Middle Passage and the transatlantic sugar trade. In a household context, these same items are not only elite luxuries, but nodes of connection between owners and enslaved, as suggested by the vignette of the president's dining table seen on the right, set with French porcelains. In this gallery, visitors encountered 4 enslaved individuals from Washington's world. Tom was one of 3 enslaved men whom Washington sold to the West Indies as punishment for what he considered Tom's bad behavior, being, quote, a rogue and a runaway. Tom's fate is unknown, but he is presumed to have died in the murderous conditions of the sugar plantations. Frank Lee held the important post of Mount Vernon's butler, managing the household from Mrs. Washington's directions and greeting all the guests as they arrived at the door. Doll was Mount Vernon's cook for more than 30 years, brought to the estate by Martha Washington as a bride from New Kent County in 1759. Doll became the matriarch of one of Mount Vernon's extended enslaved families. Carolyn Branham was a seamstress and housemaid, also brought to Mount Vernon from New Kent County by Martha Washington from the estate of her first husband, Daniel Park Custis. Carolyn and the other housemaids would have played a key role in Mount Vernon's legendary hospitality, cleaning the rooms, making beds and emptying chamber pots for overnight guests, as well as sewing and mending for both the Washington family and the enslaved. Now, it may not surprise you to think that in putting together an exhibition on 18th century slavery, there are a number of challenges encountered. 2 of the key design challenges are sort of contradictory: an excess of text and an absence of images. Information overload. This is a complex topic with lots of information. Even having edited and edited and edited down the script trying to streamline it, we ended up with more than 25,000 words, which is roughly 50 book pages. How to make this digestible in an exhibition experience, especially for people who have already probably spent 2 or 3 hours, we hope, walking around the historic area and are ready for lunch. Graphic design created a dynamic layering of information, visually distinguishing different categories of information, as you can kind of see on this label. Interpretive text, separating out interpretive text, image captions, object captions, period quotations, and so forth. Key phrases and words and sentences were bolded so that as you were going through the exhibit, you could effectively skim the top level like a newspaper headline, go on to something else if you wanted, or dive in more deeply if it was a subject you wanted to know more about. There's also an image vacuum. We wanted the exhibition to have a human presence, but how to do so for individuals whose appearance is largely unknown. To address this, we selected 17 adults whose life stories we had enough information about to be able to present in some detail. And we wanted them to represent a variety of experiences, not just the house servants who tend to be more visible in the records and better known, but also field workers, skilled artisans, and enslaved overseers, some who attained freedom and others who fled slavery but were recaptured. We were concerned that any attempt at full-scale portraiture would imply a level of certainty that we simply did not have. And so we settled on silhouettes as something that is basically period appropriate and capable of suggesting an individual presence without being too determinative. Now, this is what was for me one of the most effective passages in the exhibition. It's a recreation of an afternoon coffee enjoyed on Mount Vernon's piazza in the summer of 1796, as depicted and described by the English architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe, who was the Washington's guest that day. And so the accompanying text prompted visitors to kind of read between the lines, to consider what, or really who, is missing from Latrobe's account. So Latrobe writes in a passive voice. I sent him my letter and walked in the portfolio into the portico next to the river. Dinner was served up. Coffee was brought. My horses came to the door. Well, of course, the horses didn't just wander up to the door by themselves. They were brought by one of the groups. The coffee was served by one of the waiters, and so forth. So our education colleagues reported that teachers found this installation particularly useful. The image and the original artifacts enlivened the textual description in a way that when students are in a classroom just trying to parse an 18th century text, they don't have that image and physical presence to connect to. And the teachers were able to use this to engage students in a critical analysis of a primary source, to consider how really the structure of the language, that passive voice, can influence how we understand historical events and actors. So not only are the enslaved not talking about what they themselves did, but the passive voice effectively erased their instrumental responsibilities in Mount Vernon's hospitality. The next gallery posed a question frequently asked by our visitors, on which many have strong opinions. Washington's change. What did Washington think about slavery? Opinions that people come in with range from those who want to construe Washington as a good slave owner, who treated his people better than some masters and ultimately freed them in his will, to others for whom his slave owning negates the high regard accorded him for his essential and undeniable contributions in establishing the American Republic. So to try and straddle those two viewpoints, we really focused on the evidence, presenting the key facts of key points of evidence for which visitors might draw their own conclusions. So we needed to acknowledge the reality of George Washington's slave owning, but we also wanted to underline the divergence after the Revolution between his growing private antipathy to slavery. He would write to friends or people that he was close to, talking about how he hoped to be free of slavery, but he did not take public action based on, he was really publicly neutral, because he was convinced that the debates on slavery would tear apart the fragile nation, which ultimately it did, and preserving the nation was his first priority. This gallery was anchored by life-size silhouettes of two enslaved men, both of whom ultimately became free. On the left, you see the silhouette of Hercules, who was the Washington chef in Philadelphia during the presidential years, and who escaped to freedom on Washington's birthday in February 1797. And on the other side of the gallery, you see William Lee, who was Washington's valet. who rode with Washington throughout the 8 years of the Revolution, was considered an equally good, accomplished horseman, and was freed in 1799 by the terms of Washington's will. Lee has often been identified as the attendant in John Trumbull's 1780 portrait of George Washington, which you see a reproduction of here. And this is the figure that is identified as his valet and conceivably representing William Lee. He's shown as a slight, boyish, quite exotically clad figure with that red kind of turban on his head. Now, the status of that figure is really problematic. The artist John Trumbull presumably would have known Lee because Trumbull served as Washington's aide-de-camp for a brief 3-week period early in the war. But the portrait was not painted until nearly 5 years later in London. So it's clearly not a specific portrait of William Lee. He might have had a portrait study of Washington to work from, but his depiction of Lee would have been drawn from memory and was probably based on an unknown London model. Or more likely, as art historians have long noted, there was an established tradition in Europe of portraying important figures, aristocrats, military leaders, with a black enslaved attendant. You see one here, you see another here. They're exotically dressed. It was a convention. It was really someone who was seen as more an accessory than a person. So we chose to re-envision Lee based on what is known from documentary sources. Washington's will, for example, describes him as, quote, my mulatto man, meaning he was of mixed race. We also know, as I mentioned, that he was an accomplished horseman, rode with George Washington, who was, kept up with George Washington through fox hunts and 8 years of military endeavors. And Washington was considered the best horseman of the age. So that suggests that Lee was probably a pretty athletic figure. As Washington's valet, he was responsible for carrying his spyglass and other accoutrements, for organizing George Washington's papers and other gear. And these points, scant as they are, allow us to conjecture a rather different vision of William Lee. Not an untried youth, but a muscular man. Athletic, not a soldier in arms, but nonetheless a veteran of war. Now, the core of the exhibition was really a series of galleries on daily life on Mount Vernon's 5 farms. And this is more what you might expect of an exhibition on slavery, really looking at the daily lives of the enslaved. And here there were, again, 2 key challenges. First, as I suggested before, we have no written evidence from the perspective of the enslaved themselves. Only a handful of them were probably able to read or write and had little access to ink and pens and paper. So we can only chronicle physical conditions and circumstances extrapolated from wordless archaeological evidence and the records created by others, primarily George Washington, but also family members and visitors to the estate. And the second challenge was that we really wanted to balance, again, 2 overarching themes, which are contradictory, really. The responsibility of acknowledging the harsh reality of slavery on the one hand. The men, women, and children on George Washington's estate had little control over their own lives. They had no legal right, and although George Washington, as time went on, deliberately did not sell or separate families, that was always a possibility. On the other hand, we wanted to affirm the humanity and dignity of the enslaved as individuals. They formed families, they created tight-knit communities. Amazingly, they found ways in a cash-poor economy to earn actual cash. They acquired personal possessions, and they resisted the bonds of slavery with both strength and resilience. So among the topics that we addressed in this section were foodways, housing, social life and community, work life, punishment, and resistance. We drew heavily on archaeological resources to provide a sense of physical conditions. The foodways was based on an extended archaeological project that had been done on now demolished structure, actually demolished by George Washington, called the House for Families, which was a communal slave dwelling occupied from 1759 to 1792. An excavation carried on there in the 1980s found 3 feet of trash buried beneath the floor of this structure, containing 80,000 bones. Now, a lot of them are really tiny, but 80,000 bones representing 55 species, including wild game, domestic animals, fish, and also 33 different types of seeds, nutshells, and field crops. This, at the time, was the largest and most significant collection of slave-based faunal material unearthed in the region, and it provided really new information on the diet of the enslaved. And it demonstrated the significant initiative that enslaved people took in supplementing their rations. Their allotted rations consisted of a portion of cornmeal and dried fish each week they got. So all of these bones and the seeds and so forth are things that they are hunting or foraging on their leisure time, if you will, when they're not working for George Washington from sunup to sundown. Archaeology also provides us with a window onto the work of skilled craftspeople. Coopers, distillers, blacksmiths, grooms, dairymaids, spinners, seamstresses, and so on. African-born Samuel Anderson was not only a skilled carpenter, but he was also an accomplished hunter who earned cash by selling game to George Washington for the Washington's dinner table. After being granted his freedom by the terms of George Washington's will, he gained a firearms license from Fairfax County and saved enough money to purchase the freedom of several family members. George was one of 3 enslaved gardeners who worked to maintain Mount Vernon's picturesque landscape and ornamental and kitchen gardens. In August of 1798, he weeded and planted strawberries, transplanted orange trees, and sowed seeds for spinach and other greens. Another skilled occupation was that of midwifery, performed for the enslaved women of Mount Vernon in the 1790s by Kate, in addition to her regular assignment as a field worker. Kate's services as a midwife help us consider how Mount Vernon's enslaved people dealt with universal experiences like birth, illness, and death, and how music, storytelling, religion, customs, and ceremonies allowed them to build community and affirm their humanity in a world that united. Now, as a field worker, Kate received just one set of clothes each summer and each winter, made from coarsely woven linen or wool. And that's the basis for a reproduction version that you see on the screen. But from her earnings as a midwife, perhaps several pounds a year, she might have been able to purchase small articles of personal adornment, such as these buckles and sleeve buttons or cufflinks recovered archaeologically. Or these fragments of a tea service, reassembled to recreate the scene described by a European visitor to a slave cabin on one of the outlying farms in 1798. He wrote, "The husband and wife sleep on a mean pallet, the children on the ground, a very bad fireplace, some utensils for cooking, but in the middle of this poverty, some cups and a teapot." Men like Giles, who worked as a coachman accompanying George Washington's carriage when he traveled, and others in highly visible positions in the household were required to wear well-tailored wool livery suits in the white and red of the Washington coat of arms. Again, a reproduction version based on the documentation. Agricultural workers are the hardest to know of enslaved workers, but Washington's weekly farm reports document work assignments in such detail that we can reconstruct not only seasonal cycles of work, but a conjectural day in the life of a worker on one of his 4 outlying farms, starting at 5:15, 5:45 a.m. and continuing until late in the afternoon. Of course, that would vary according to the year and when the sun came up and when the sun went down. Davy Gray was brought to Mount Vernon as a teenager by Martha Washington in 1759, and he became one of the handful of enslaved men who became overseers, supervising day-to-day operations on the outlying farms and administering punishment to his fellow enslaved workers when Washington's pretty exacting standards were not met. When it came to topics of punishment and resistance, the message that we heard from descendants of the enslaved and local African American constituents that we worked with was clear. Quote, "Don't sugarcoat the brutality of slavery." To this end, we presented documented examples of both punishment, including demotion to less desirable jobs, whipping, quote, when warranted, and sale, like Tom in the 1760s. But also resistance, working slowly or feigning illness, to breaking tools or attempting escape. Caesar was one individual who resisted by leaving Mount Vernon, absenting himself without permission on at least 3 occasions in the 1790s, perhaps to visit family members on other plantations in the area. Advertisements for his return describe him as a literate man who frequently, quote, reads or preaches to the blacks. No record has been found for any punishment that he might have received for his absences. Now, here's an example of one of George Washington's weekly farm reports. So the way this worked is that each outlying farm had an overseer, and the overseer was required to submit a report to the farm manager. And the farm manager, when Washington was away at the presidency, the farm manager would send the summary report to Washington in Philadelphia. And before the post went back down to Mount Vernon, Washington would write back, having clearly read through this report in great detail with very pointed questions. And then many of these contain charts where it's worked out how many hours are spent working in which field, how many hours were lost to illness. I like to say that had Washington lived today, he would have certainly loved Excel spreadsheets. Absolutely loved them. He's really crunching the numbers. In addition to work assignments, the weekly farm reports provide clues to personal life, like Kate nursing her son Billy, 6 days. Died this day, William, a son of Kate and Will, about 12 years old, who is described as, quote, a promising boy, likely meaning he promised to be a good worker. Now, what links all these documents together is the census that I showed you earlier that Washington made in July 1799, enumerating the 317 men, women, and children, their ages if known, their family members, their occupation, which farm they were assigned to, their property status, that is, whether they were owned by Washington himself, by the Custis estate, or whether they were leased, and sometimes details about their physical conditions, such as lame, dwarf, or past labor. And this information, in turn, enables us to identify these people in other references. For example, we know that Priscilla, a field worker on one of Washington's farms, was in 1799, 36 years old, with 6 children, ages 1 to 14, Sophia, Savory, Penny, Israel, Azarias, and Christopher. She was stationed on Dogue Run Farm, which is this outlying farm, which is 3 or 4 or 5 miles away from the Mansion House farm, where her husband, Slammin' Joe, was a ditcher, effectively kind of a civil engineer in charge of digging ditches for irrigation and drainage and so forth. He would have been allowed to visit them on Sundays, their one day when they weren't working, and for unauthorized what was called night walking, which means walking through the woods to wherever your family is and then coming back before daybreak in the morning. Not surprisingly, George Washington complained about that people were tired because they were doing night walking. For some, we can trace kinship through multiple generations. Doll, as I mentioned, was the matriarch of an extended family that included her son Will and his wife Kate, who I mentioned, her daughter Lucy, who was married to the butler Frank Lee, that I mentioned earlier, and her grandson Christopher Shields, who became Washington's valet at the end of his life and was one of those in attendance on his deathbed. This level of detail, complexity, and continuity is rarely matched in 18th century America, where you often get only one reference to an enslaved person's entire life. Presenting this information called for more text than could be incorporated in the exhibition labels. And so we created interactive tablets. You see someone using one of them on the left, for the 17 featured individuals. For each, the frame that you see for Priscilla provided basic information: name, family members, occupation, place of residence, and who they were owned by, and a very brief bio. The touchscreen tablets invited further information, providing timelines of events in their lives, maps of associated places, both on the estate and if they were someone like Hercules, who had occasion to travel off the estate, family trees, and what we know about their personal appearance. Now, the final gallery in the exhibition begins with George Washington's life and the execution of the clause in his will by which he provided that the 123 individuals he owned were to be freed upon Martha Washington's death. The 150-some people owned by the estate of the Custis estate, called the dower slaves, were not free. That was a decision that would have had to been made by the Custis estate, and they chose not to free them. Now, the main focus of the exhibition was on slavery at Mount Vernon in the 18th century, because that's our period of interpretation. But this gallery offers an epilogue, and it was the direct result of conversations that we had with descendants and local African American constituents who said, you can't just end the story in 1799. You have to talk about what happened next. And what happened next was a wrenching, really, moment in the aftermath of George and Martha Washington's death, because this community that had evolved over the preceding 4 decades was split up, with the enslaved status following that of the mother. So in those 4 decades, Custis slaves had intermarried with Washington slaves, and the children of those marriages, their status if the mother was owned by the Custis estate, they all remained enslaved. And the Custis dower slaves were in turn split up between Martha Washington's 4 grandchildren. And what you see here are lists of which grandchild got which enslaved people. So these people are property being divided and allocated in just the way that Martha Washington's personal possessions are. And that seemed just a very gripping sort of driving home this experience. Kitty, who was a skilled milkmaid and skinner at Masham House Farm, was one who saw her family separated into 5 different places. Her husband was free. She and her children were split up among the 4 different grandchildren. Some of the enslaved people freed by Washington's will remained in the local area, constructing new lives. Some, like Sambo Anderson that I mentioned, were able to earn money and purchase freedom of family members who were owned by the Custis estate and remained enslaved. Several, including Nancy Carter Quander, returned to the estate in the 1830s to assist with the landscaping around Washington's tomb. Meanwhile, later Washington owners of Mount Vernon brought new communities of enslaved. West Ford, for example, was brought to Mount Vernon in 1802 by George Washington's nephew Bushrod, who inherited Mount Vernon. In 1805, West Ford was freed by the terms of Bushrod's mother's will, and he remained a Washington employee for several decades, rising to become plantation manager. Bushrod bequeathed him 160 acres of land, which he used to purchase additional land that became the foundation of the free black community of Gum Springs, just a few miles away from Mount Vernon. Slavery at Mount Vernon ended in 1860 with the purchase of the estate by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And in the subsequent decades, a number of free local African Americans were hired back as employees. Farm workers, gardeners, guards, butler, housekeeper, often serving as the primary interface with visitors who came to the estate. Edmund Parker had been enslaved in the 1840s and 1850s at Mount Vernon, came back in the 1880s and 90s to serve as a tomb guard. Now, Lives Bound Together, as Pat mentioned, closed in 2021 after a run of nearly 5 years. But by consolidating and presenting the extensive archival and archaeological research compiled by Mount Vernon staff since the 1980s, it had and continues to have a transformative effect on research and interpretation of the estate. And its impact continues. It lives on in the minds of nearly 700,000 visitors, many of whom had little previous, came from places in the country where they had little previous awareness of the history of slavery. It lives on online in a virtual tour, in web pages that provide the biographies and other content of the exhibition, in primary source information in our database, which includes more than 35,000 references drawn from George Washington papers to enslaved individuals. It inspired our recently released 8-episode podcast called Intertwine, and in curriculum materials included in our vibrant online educational resources portal, designed to support further exploration into Washington's world both in and out of the classroom. This includes the collections of primary sources, distance learning programs, lesson plans, student resources, not just on slavery, but on a wide variety of topics about Washington's world. For teachers with a particular interest in the subject, we offer each summer an intensive 5-day on-site residential program as part of our George Washington Teacher Institute program. Other units focus on Washington and the founding of the U.S. government, Washington as military commander, Washington the businessman. You can see a certain theme running through all of these. Leadership and women of the 18th century. And in the fall of 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, when we weren't having on-site teacher institutes, we created a 3-day digital symposium. 20 different speakers offering more than 22 hours of content with more than 1,000 teachers registered. It lives on in enhanced on-site interpretation by in-person and character interpreters, an audio guide, and a self-guiding brochure that you see here, which includes a map highlighting relevant locations on the estate. It lives on in oral histories, now archived in our library and available online. These are really moving comments by 6 descendants of people who were enslaved at Mount Vernon, talking about what they knew from oral traditions in their family, or how they learned that they were descended from enslaved people at Mount Vernon, and what it feels like for them to walk the grounds where their ancestors were enslaved, and how they regard George Washington. It lives on in the relationships that we nurtured with descendants and local African American constituencies in the preparation of the exhibit, and in the recent formation of the League of Descendants of the Enslaved at Mount Vernon, with whom we look forward to working with on future projects. Some of these include our ongoing effort to locate individual graves at the cemetery used by the enslaved on a timbered ridge just a few rods south of George Washington's tomb. This effort began in 2014, led by Mount Vernon's professional archaeologists, assisted by volunteers, and to date we have located more than 80 grave shafts. We think there may be as many as 150 there. And the way this works is we remove just the top sort of 4, 5, 6 inches of soil until you can see the difference in coloration. When you dig soil out, pile it up, and then put it back in, it's a different mixture of soils than undisturbed soil. So you can see that color differentiation very clearly. So we locate those, we map them in a GPS mapping system, and then they're covered back over so no human remains are disturbed. The cemetery is commemorated by daily wreath-laying ceremonies, spring through fall, and an annual ceremony in October. We are also leading a multi-year archaeological investigation of George Washington's Union Farm in collaboration with Fairfax County and George Washington University. Amazingly, that the pink triangle that you see in the red circle had remained intact amid surrounding suburban development. And if you overlay, as we've done here, the modern map on George Washington's 1795 Five Farms map, it reveals that this particular parcel is the site of where the slave cabins were located on this outlying farm. Now, most archaeology that has been done on enslaved occupations are associated with the big house, because that's what tends to have been survived while outlying areas get redeveloped. So we think this is a really exciting opportunity to learn more about what life was like away from the big house. First year of archaeological field work located several exciting features. This is what for archaeologists is an exciting feature. It's again the soil coloration that represents a post hole. The size suggests that it was probably for a farm structure, perhaps like a chicken coop or something like that. You can also see from the LIDAR, and I forget what that stands for, but you can see that it takes away you take away the layer of the trees, but you can see things like plow furrows. You can see Washington's farm road, which in fact still survives, and you can see that in the lane going to this property. That's the location of Washington's original farm road to this farm center. What was for me one of the most really rewarding research pieces was what I call a case of mistaken identity. The portrait that you see on the right is located in a museum in Madrid, Spain. Since the 1970s, it has gradually come, well, since the 1990s, it's been published as a portrait of George Washington's cook, Hercules, attributed to Gilbert Stuart, who painted the famous portrait of George Washington that you see on the dollar bill. Because it's over in a museum in Spain, American art historians hadn't really been able to take a close look at it, and the museum in Spain, it's really not a priority for them, frankly. They're interested in old masters and contemporary art, so nobody had really done the hardcore research on it. We were fortunate in being able to borrow it from the museum in Madrid, and they were very gracious in allowing us to conduct a study day with a number of art historians who specialize in Gilbert Stuart, conservators who've worked on Gilbert Stuart paintings. We brought them all together. We looked at it together with two Gilbert Stuarts in our collection. For art historical and technical reasons that I won't go into, it's very clear it's not a Gilbert Stuart. It's probably a British provincial painter, and nobody's very interested in British provincial painters either, so nobody studied them. So it's just kind of in this vacuum. But it's very clear it's not by Gilbert Stuart, and when you take away the Gilbert Stuart connection, there's no reason to associate it with Washington's cook. There's just no connection. Plus, this hat that you see, although it had been sort of described as a chef's hat, that kind of hat for chefs doesn't remotely come into being until the 1820s. So it's not a Gilbert Stuart, it's not a chef, it's not George Washington's cook. Fortunately, the museum, again in Spain, they don't really care about it, so they were fine with reattributing it. But what's really exciting is saying that this isn't Hercules prompted other researchers to go looking for what happened to Hercules. And they actually found him in the city directories in New York, where he had taken on the name of his previous owner before George Washington. Because obviously, he doesn't want to escape and go to somewhere, you know, enslaved people often took the last surnames of their owners. He doesn't want to call himself Hercules Washington because he's going to get found right away. So he calls himself Hercules Posey. He lives in New York until 1812. He works sometimes as a chef. And so we've identified what happened to him as a result of doing careful research on the portrait. We have also had the opportunity to consult with several dozen academic and public history organizations from local entities like Arlington House, Gunston Hall in Northern Virginia, George Washington University, to national and international ones, including the National Gallery of Art, Historic New England, the National Trusts of Scotland, and the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Lies Bound Together lives on in our latest exhibition, which is called Mount Vernon, The Story of an American Icon, which is a reinstallation of our permanent collection organized around the many stories of this iconic place, starting with the earliest Native American encampments some 10,000 years ago, which we know from some 26 archaeological Native American sites on the property, through its development by several generations of Washingtons both before and after George and Martha, and its preservation by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association from 1860 to the present. And it includes many of what we thought were we knew from watching people in the exhibit, were the most engaging and effective elements in the exhibition, building on the premise that the stories of the enslaved are integral to the full understanding of Washington and Mount Vernon. So we have, again, these reproduction costume items with some of the artifacts from the skilled trade back in the corner of this gallery. We have slavery interpreted as one of four main themes about how to look at history from objects. We have a recreation of that piazza scene with the text about reading between the lines. We have a lot of these things about foodways and housing, furnishings from archaeology. We have some of the portraits. We have a re-envisioning of that vignette with the tea service. This case talks about, again, the dividing up of the enslaved community after George or Martha Washington's death, and the property, both human and artifactual, that was divided up. We have an enlarged label on West Ford and his story of what happens at Mount Vernon in the 19th century. Finally, it lives on in publications and ongoing research, from which you can learn more. This is The Only Unavoidable Subject of Regret, which is the book written by our estate historian, Mary Thompson, who began researching the subject when she arrived at Mount Vernon, fresh out of graduate school in 1980. And it's really her research in combination with the findings of our archaeology team that was the foundation for all of the material I've presented today. And I'm pleased to say that it was the winner of the Best Biography Prize awarded by the Society for the History of Early American Republic to the author of original biography, broadly defined. And I want to just read what they said about it. Quote, while not a traditional biography of Washington, the book is an essential contribution to the study of his life, revealing his character through his practice of slavery, the cultural and social economic foundation of his identity as an 18th century elite Virginian. The book amounts to new required reading on the first subject in American biography. Slavery at Mount Vernon was fundamental to George Washington's character and life, and those in turn have broadest implications for how we approach the founders in general. On a smaller scale, we also published a catalog accompanying the exhibition, which includes fuller stories of the 17 adults that were featured in Lies Bound Together and I talked about today. I did bring a few, this is the shameless promotional piece of the program. I brought a few copies down with me. If anyone is interested, I'm offering them today at the bargain price of $10, which is half of the retail. And if you want one, see my associate, who is somewhere here, that my husband, also known as my husband Bill, in the back of the audience. I think, perhaps one of the biggest takeaways from the exhibition is how much we have to learn. When I came to Mount Vernon in 2010, we had one case in our manuscript gallery devoted to slavery. And we change out the manuscript and other light-sensitive items every 6 months. And I remember being told very clearly by our exhibition registrar, it's really hard to keep this case full because we just don't have that much material on slavery. Well, I hope I've disproved that. We have a multitude of evidence, perhaps more than any 18th century plantation in America. And much of that evidence has long been hiding in plain sight. We just hadn't been asking the right questions. Thank you very much. If we have time, I'm happy to address any of you.
Thank you. That's a wonderful presentation. Were you disappointed, or was there ever an intent of a permanent exhibition?
There's always a debate. There was a debate from the time we created it and we talked about it. You know, is it better to have slavery as a standalone exhibition that you can delve into it in great detail, or to show it as, again, integral and fundamental to the whole story of the place? Ultimately, I would love to have been able to do both. We just frankly don't have that much exhibition gallery space. So I was thrilled that it continued for 5 years instead of the original one, and I'm thrilled that it has a lot of ongoing legs. But yes, in many ways I would have loved to have been able to continue it, because I think it gained momentum as time went on. We didn't do a lot of active promotion, so it was largely word of mouth that people came to know about it. And of course, you know, from 2016 to 2021, public interest changed. Yes, ma'am.
I have visited Mount Vernon, I think at least after 2016. My question is this: I got the impression that when that from Washington's will, that many slaves were given to Martha, was the idea that she would release them or set them free at her death. And she went ahead and released and set them free because it was kind of dangerous to keep and enslave people that were waiting for her to die.
Yeah, now that's a very good question. And it's always been a little, you know, you look back in retrospect and you think, what was he thinking with that provision? Now, you know, there are a total of some 300 enslaved people on the estate. They weren't given to Martha. The ones that Washington owned were part of his estate. The others were part of the Custis estate that neither George nor Martha had the legal authority to free unless the heirs were willing to free them or to compensate the estate. So the only thing that we could figure out is that Washington knew that freeing his slaves was going to divide up families. He was, for at least the last couple years of his, couple decades of his life, very committed to not breaking up families. And he knew that his freeing his slaves, because he talked to the Custis heirs to try and get them to also free their slaves, and they were not interested. So he knew that his death would break up families once, and that Martha's death would break them up again. So the thinking is that delayed provision would be just one wrenching breakup. But there is a letter in which Martha Washington writes to Abigail Adams in which she hints that she is concerned for her safety. And so Washington dies in December 1799. Martha frees his slaves January of 1801, so just a little over a year later, and then she doesn't die until June of 1802, or May of 1802. Yes, sir.
Was there any reason why did your research lead to Martha Washington's seamstress owning?
Yes, yes, and I think I have her picture in here once. I didn't talk extensively about Ona Judge, was her formal name, was owned by the Custis estate, and she was the Washingtons took about 9 enslaved people with them to the presidential residence in Philadelphia during the presidency. Ona was Martha Washington's lady's maid, and she escaped, self-liberated in, I think, May of 1796. successfully made her way to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where she lived until the 1840s, despite some fairly concerted efforts by the Washingtons to recover her. I think, you know, it's notable that she was Martha Washington's property. Martha was very attached to her, did not understand why she would be leaving, which was a relatively better position, if you will, because she was a lady's maid. And I think Martha really pushed the effort to try and recover her, which they never did. She married a sailor, had 3 children. They were in poverty by the time of her death. And she was interviewed for the newspaper in the 1840s and asked if she, you know, because of her hard life, if she regretted leaving her relatively preferred position with the Washingtons, and she said, no, because I was free. And she is the subject of a recent biography by a historian in Dunbar Smith. I can't think of her first name. So thank you for raising that.
Several times during your
there's more in the catalog.
So several times during your presentation, you made reference to presenting information and getting feedback from, I assume it was a community of people that you brought together, which include probably African American people. And I was just wondering how you went about creating that group.
Right. Sure. Great question. So yeah, we've worked with a group of scholars who are working in this area. We did several focus groups at the African American History Museum in Alexandria. So descendants of the free black communities in the local area in many cases, as well as people who moved there more recently. We had since Mary Thompson started her work in the 1980s, we had been building relationships with descendants of enslaved people in 18th century and 19th century Mount Vernon, principally people who self-identified. As I know from my family history that I'm descended from someone at Mount Vernon, it's harder to go forward in time because many of the enslaved people, the freed people, when they were enslaved, they didn't have surnames. So it's very hard to sort out in the subsequent reference to follow genealogy. Now more and more is being done all the time with black genealogy. Government agencies are putting their records online, so more and more of that is being done. But most of the people we knew are people who came to us and said, we know that our people came from Mount Vernon. And so we had focus groups with them. Several of them were quite active in working with us. And as I mentioned, they've now created a formal organization because many of them, you know, the people we did oral histories with, they were spread all over the country. They didn't know each other before we started this project, and now they have come together to create a descendants group, which is something that is happening at many sites. Well, thank you for your...
Thank you so much.